on 160 meters tonight. Does anybody know? Stan, you should be able to figure this out. Warm the worms or you'll warm the clouds.
It depends on what kind of antenna you have.
Very good. See, he knows. All right. Who here has operated on 160 meters? So you've been on 160, you've been on 160. What were you using for an antenna?
A long wire.
Oh, really? And
That was my father's house.
Oh, in those days.
Because this would be across the road if I put
Sure.
it in this house.
And how long was the long wire?
What's that?
How long was the long wire, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. It was long. I don't remember.
So ladder line and a tuner?
No,
And the
I
wire?
used a one-to-one ballad.
Oh,
I
okay.
used coax.
I've got 100 and some odd foot dipole up fed with 450 ohms twin
Yeah.
lead into a tuner.
Okay. So then,
Works great.
sure. So what you're doing, when you have that kind of a configuration, right, is, so you've got it set up like this. And this is the standard 135 foot denomination?
100 and something. Whatever room I had for it.
Okay. Pardon me for doing it this way. On that dimension, 135 feet. And what's the ladder line?
Ladder line is the amount I needed to get into the tuner.
Okay, but
For 450 ohms.
but what's the length?
I say the amount I needed to get into the tuner.
Come on, a little bit better than that. Well, here's the whole concept, Doc. The combination of the ladder line plus 135, if it works out to 260, will work, or will tune. But it could be still considerably shorter, and you could still tune it up. Were
How
you
high does
using
it have
the
to be?
internal tuner on your rig, or did you
No.
have an external tuner?
I've got the
Johnson Max
Amazon,
box.
ATR 30.
Okay.
How high does it have to be?
What do you mean? One of those? People do this all the time. Although, actually, you know, it's for more, sometimes people have odd length antennas that are 150, 160 feet. But the whole notion is, it's going to be tall enough so that the vertical feed line becomes part of the antenna and it's off the ground and going straight up in the air. So yeah, to actually use this kind of a configuration, the antenna is going to be up to 85 to 90 feet. You might have slough going back and forth though.
65 feet, 70 feet as well.
Okay.
Can you put a bobtail on the end of it?
Yeah, people do all kinds of things, but we'll talk about that. I just wanted to see who's been on the air. So now, you've heard a couple stations on. What's the furthest station away you've ever heard on 160 meters using that antenna?
I don't remember.
Okay. But local stuff. You were hearing New Englanders, Pennsylvania,
Yeah, I mean,
Ohio.
I use it for a net.
Right.
We have an 80 meter net that periodically goes to 160 because
Right.
of all the QRM.
New York State.
New York,
Coverage.
New Jersey, Maryland.
Okay. All right, so we got two. Anybody else put on 160?
Yeah. The Carolina one that we put up.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can really force one of those if you have to. It's
Yeah.
not an optimal
Those
configuration.
locals, all like New York and Jersey.
Right. All right, very good. Yeah, the warm the worms, or you'll warm the clouds, refers to antennas. So we'll get into that in 3 or 4 panels. But let me just get to the first slide.
You want me to work that?
Yeah, actually, if you would. I have been on 160 meters, but trust me, I am not a battle-scarred vet. I've probably made 200 QSOs on 160. Largely in the function of 2 contests in consecutive years at 75 hits apiece. So, you know, mostly contests, then maybe 50 QSOs
On
freelancing.
AM?
Sorry?
On AM?
No, on sideband. I've yet to do a CW contact. I will before the winter's out, though. In the old days, 160 meters was tough territory to pursue because Loran D navigation was its dominant use until Loran D was discontinued, what, mid-70s, I'm thinking?
Yeah.
And then the band was eventually given to general purpose ham use, I think 78, 79, in this neck of the woods. If you were coastal Connecticut or New England, 160 meant, I think, 50 watts at night in very limited slices of the band. But the other aspect of 160 in those days was it didn't come with ready-made transceivers. In other words, if you wanted to get on 160, you were building it. And there used to be standard designs that you could see in QST or in the ARRL handbook. They would have at least one design a year for a 160 meter transmitter so that you could get on the air. So the big changeover for 160 access started about in the 80s when you saw the modern generation of transceivers where it was not only 80 through 10, but they could throw in 160, and they did. So net result is Anybody can get on the air. But in the old days, it did get the reputation of being the gentleman's band. Why? Well, it's kind of exclusionary and kind of elitist, not that there's anything wrong with that. But the whole basic notion is the average Joe Blow couldn't get on the band. You had to be an engineer or somebody who wanted to work with surplus equipment and convert it in order to get on in those days. So, kind of distinguished the men from the boys. But, yeah, like I say, 50 watts and just a couple 25 kilohertz slivers was all you got to operate if you were coastal Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. Very good. So, if you get on and you even just listen to 160, essentially most of the action, if you're looking for anything exciting, is going to be in the range from 1800 to 1840, and that is essentially the DX window. In fact, really, it's just where the free-ranging activity, where you see people as individuals pursuing QSOs, they're going to be in that range. Most serious DX operating is done by CW. Doesn't mean people are pure CW operators. Now, a lot of people who can't do CW worth the darn will just use a keyboard operation. But CW still works out better and distinguishes you as a serious DX operator on 160. It's not to say that you can't operate sideband. You can, and you'll make plenty of contacts in the end. But sideband activity starts at around 1.840, but what's unusual about 160 when it comes to the bands is that there's no official delineation of what is CW and what is sideband, so everything here is an honorary agreement. And during competitions, for instance, the sideband competition coming up at the end of the month, you will see sideband operators infiltrating down into that window. So, if you've ever been on the air and you just tune across the band and you're using a coat hanger as an antenna, in this neck of the woods, you will typically hear activity that's concentrated around 2 or 3 groups I've just heard over the years. So there's one group that sits here, another group over at 1.875, and there's another one, I don't know, what might be 1.910 in that vicinity, somewhere around there, plus or minus on a 10 KC. These guys are just a bunch of yahoos that have been talking together for years. They're friendly folks. Engineers, a couple guys I've met up on this frequency, and the other guys that are up past 1900 are also very friendly. So, you can check in and the guys will talk to you. Interesting conversations all. But the most interesting conversation I ever had on 160 was with a gentleman that was up in this neck of the woods who's an engineer from one of the maritime facilities up on the Cape. So, if you are just doing a general coverage receiver, or you've got a marginal antenna and you're tuning by, go by those frequencies anytime after, say, 8 o'clock at night, and you should be able to hear some activity eventually. When there are contests, you'll be amazed how much activity you will hear. The sideband competition for CQ Magazine for 160 was last week. If you tuned across the band, I heard about 100 different CW stations in the DX window going up and down. I didn't work any of them. I wasn't equipped to use CW. And my antenna for 160 is not up at the moment. But I did hear quite a few signals on. And so it's like anything else on the bands these days. I'm convinced that conditions aren't as bad as everybody says they are. There's just nobody on operating anymore. That's my conclusion anyway, in terms of explaining a lot of propagation. So, once you do get on 160, make it a point to call, and someone will eventually hear you. Every time I've ever called on 160, eventually I have gotten a return call. The other thing to just bear in mind, though, is if you're trying to get or establish an idea as to how much activity you're going to have on 160, or how much you're going to hear on 160, remember, the antenna is the limiting factor. And so if you're not hearing anything at your house, give me a call. Give me an appointment so you can come over to my place and listen, because you may have a different experience. This is just one of those bands where unless you've got the right antenna, you may hear almost nothing. Okay, next slide.
There's also a lot of AM on it, too.
You heard it specifically
A lot of AM.
recently? Yeah, well, the thing is it's a traditional band. And like I say, 2 or 3 slivers, I've heard AM activity, though, up at around 1875, 1880. Are you talking about that neck of the woods? Yeah, I've heard 1 or 2 stations over the years. If you have an AM rig, It can be fun. And no one will complain on 160 that you're using AM. That's kind of one of the distinguishing characteristics because, you know, when it first became very popular and was available through the modern rig going back 10 or 15 years ago, I used to listen to a lot of activity on 160. Now, I'm just not hearing it. I'm afraid it's just some of the old timers have, you know, gone under the next hand radio world, for lack of a better way to put it. But if you really want to hear action and get a baseline as to how much activity can be potentially sustained on the band and see what the propagation can be like, December is when the ARRL has their 160 CW contest. And that's all they do. They don't have a sideband contest. CQ Magazine does sponsor the CW contest, and we just had that last weekend.
There was also Winter Field Day was last week.
Right. From there, the sideband contest comes up now at the end of February. And this is where I would tell anybody that's got any casual interest in 160 to tune in. Because like I said, that's when you get a good baseline of what the band is capable of working with or doing.
That should say CQ 160 as this band.
So, this is what confronts us all. This is where we'll spend some time talking about yard layouts too, if you want. What do you need to get out of here, and how are you going to do it? It's antennas. This is what keeps people happy here on 160. So, length requirement for a pure 1/2 wavelength dipole is 260 feet. Height requirement. This is what's really difficult to attain. Ready for this? If you're talking about a half wavelength up, it's 273 feet on 160 meters. Like I say, does anybody own a twin-towered mini skyscraper? I've gotten a QSL card, seen a picture of the guy over in Italy, and I think that's what he was operating on. And it wasn't a mini skyscraper, it was just two apartment buildings joined together. And he might have been the janitor. You know, he just throws the wires over and then temporarily pulls it out between the two buildings. But he was up there, and I don't know, he gave it to me in meters. I thought he said he was up the equivalent, around 120 feet or so. And interestingly enough, that still doesn't cut it. It's not even close. Whereas you'd be putting out an excellent signal if you were operating on 80 meters.
It's close to a city block long. I mean, 20
It's a lot of
blocks in a
space.
mile.
It's a lot of space. So, here's the other thing to consider though. Largely, no matter what you do, if you go horizontal, you're limited to 200 miles, and beyond that, you'll never hear a damn thing on 160 meters. The good news is if you've decided to go that route, a trap dipole isn't much worse than just a conventional dipole. And so, as I'm saying here, you can pull this off on a small lot if you want to go the trap dipole route. That'll be, you know, one of the basic strategies that I'll recommend as we go through this. Here's the thing though. What's a cloud warmer? The cloud warmer is an antenna that when you key up, sends all the RF straight up into the air. That's a cloud warmer. And unless you can get a dipole antenna or an equivalent horizontal antenna up a half wavelength, that's what tends to happen with most of the RF that gets radiated, it goes straight up. This works out very well for talking to people in Pennsylvania, sometimes Ohio, Maryland, Delaware, the New England states, New York State. Again, the lengths. I mentioned 260 feet, but actually for the off-center fed dipole, for a lot of the designs, add another 10, 15, or 16 feet to that, depending upon whose design you use. But I did hear somebody mention the horizontal loop. So, who was it? Were you saying that you were considering?
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about that. Because this one is definitely subject to some debate. Gus, may he rest in peace. That's what he operated with on 160 meters, and Gus used to swear that he had very good luck on 160. I was never over his house watching him work DX, though. I only saw him work local stations. And honestly, I don't know that a horizontal loop is all that good. Gus had his up at 75 feet. And I think he told me, though, that he finished maybe second or third in New England in the 160-meter sideband competition going back 7 or 8 years ago. But it's a lot of antenna to get up in the air. And I just don't know that they're that good because I've seen other people rip that design to pieces and just say that in the end, that this is a horizontal radiator because it's a horizontal loop, and that like any other horizontal antenna, it suffers from the lack of height with respect to the real wavelength. So, all right, next slide. Because here's the alternatives And if you really work hard, or if you're really sneaky, you may be able to pull off one of these designs. So, verticals, worm warmers. Why are they referred to as worm warmers? Because you run radials on the ground, and when you key up the RF, you warm the worms. As a result, you're warming the worms and not the clouds, and people can hear you. But if you're going to work DX, this is the way you have to go. Now, who's actually listened on a vertical? Have you ever listened on a friend's vertical on 160? I don't mean to discourage you, but when you listen to a vertical, it can be very discouraging. My vertical configuration runs on an oak tree that goes up 90 feet, so it's really nice. And it's an inverted L configuration, on my home lot, because my next door neighbor is nice enough to loan me his maple tree to hook up to. So it's an inverted L configuration, 80 feet up, 40 feet over. Really, and it works out pretty well. It's noisy as all hell because part of it goes right by the power lines. But I put up with it, for the limited amount of operation I do. But other options, a vertical loop, 558 feet, that's asking a lot. But I can just tell you that if you were to find an oak tree that's 110 feet or 125 feet high, and you just shot, put the tennis ball cannon over it, and just pulled the ends out far enough and staked them to a couple of trees, you could actually put one of these up easier than it sounds. The matching there is 100 ohms though, so either you're going to be feeding this with an tuner, or you're going to get a 2-to-1 balun. A vertical, 130 feet, straight up. 20 ohm feed point, that requires a specialty balun as well, unless you just have, again, a remote tuner in series with the antenna. In that case, the tuner will just handle all of that. Nice option. Do you know anybody that's got 130 feet something or other that you can hang an antenna off of, though? That is the question.
I might.
You do.
Yeah, I got some hemlocks.
You have a hemlock, really?
Yeah.
So what do you think the tallest hemlock is?
It might be my neighbor's, it might be mine, but
Right. Does your neighbor like you?
it's hers when I want to cut down.
Right. Does your neighbor like you, though? I mean, you have any
She
problems?
don't care.
Oh, good.
I don't
Okay.
think she'd notice if I shot it up.
That's the whole key.
She doesn't
Well,
even
so we'll
pick
ta-
up her own mail.
We'll talk about this design if that's the case. The thing is, a vertical at 130 feet is actually just about the best transmitting antenna you could reasonably ask for on 160. And if you looked at the serious 160 operators of the world, something like 75% of them are using a full-length vertical. Doesn't necessarily mean they're using elaborate design. They can't have something that's 150 feet up that they're hanging a wire 135 feet down from. That's the essence of simplicity and economy, if you can do that. What's an inverted L, and why is it in here? You'll note there's two versions, and we'll talk about the reason for that in just a minute. An inverted L is a vertical put up by somebody who doesn't have 130 feet vertical run. That's all it is. You could describe it as a bent vertical. Some people, when they describe it inverted L, give it magical capabilities. Like I say, all it really is it's a vertical, you run out of room, so you bend the top over, unless you get a nice match on your frequency. And you don't affect the radiation pattern as much as you think, because when you have a vertical antenna, most of the radiation is actually done in the very first part of the vertical. That's where most of the current is, and that's where most of the radiation comes from. So, if you use a quarter length or a quarter wavelength version of the inverted L, it'll run you 130 feet. It's like I say, a vertical, and you bend it at some point. The ideal thing is to hang it from a tree, that's what I'm currently doing, and have the line continue on to another tree. So in my case, guys, my run is 115 feet up and 25 feet over. And if you can get into that kind of a configuration, then a quarter wave inverted L is pretty much a vertical for all intents and purposes. The other design may strike you as a little odd because it's a 3/8 wavelengths design and it's 175 feet. But commercial manufacturers that sell inverted Ls sell a lot of these antennas. And here's the reason why. Because the average person does their inverted L just like I do, over the major tree, and then another row over an adjacent tree to just give it the necessary horizontal distance, right? it tends to work out very well in terms of efficiency because with the increased length, the current point where most of the RF is radiated from the antenna is raised significantly higher by a function of about 30 feet. So this design, if you can pull it off, interesting enough, gets out much better than this design and has the advantage that a very simple C network can be set up for you to match to that antenna. Now do understand, I'm just describing theory. I'm not that elegant. I just use a remote tuner in series with the antenna. So, I'm no master of that part of it. Other options.
What tuner do you use?
I have an old LDG. It's a real old one. Did you ever hear the RT10? It was a very popular model. Back in the days when SGC was the other big competitor for remote ones. It's in a self-contained waterproof box with a nice gasket, and you have a remote control head, and you operate it with RT11 cable, and it really works well. Essence is simplicity. It's like a 15-year-old design now, but I got two of them about 10 years ago. Other things you can pull off. Stadium light tower. We'll talk about that later. A lot of hams, though, who have a tower in their backyard will take the tower and load it up as a 160-meter antenna. You put down as many radials as you can, or you use elevated radials, and then you just load up the tower. And if you were ham out in the Midwest where you had a 70-foot tower, right, and then had a nice antenna on the top of it, you're not really efficient, but you're still getting out better than most people on 160 if you just load the tower up. The other possibility is that you just have the tower with a sloper that comes off the tower, and that's kind of a standardized design in a lot of hams too. So basically, when you're feeding it in series with the coax, the shield is going to the tower, and the center insulator is going to the downward feed. Okay, next one. Radials. It's actually fun to put down radials. If you're trying to disguise your intent from your neighbors, it's the ultimate stealth challenge. But now hear me out. If it's going to be a vertical, and really what we said about inverted antennas is they're verticals in the end, right? For all their characteristics. They need radials. There's a lot of those antenna companies that make these magical, very tall antennas that people pay $475 for so that you can load up on an antenna that's a vertical that allegedly needs no radials. And they all suck. No kidding. Fortunately, 160 is so challenging that no manufacturer known can try to fake you into thinking that their antenna can operate without radials. So here's the principle. If you're going to go with ground radials, minimum length 105 feet, maximum length 125 feet. Mind you, if you have a 140-foot wire and you don't want to cut it, that's fine too. You can put it down and it might add 1 zillionth, to the efficiency of the antenna. Some people are challenged to find that much space. And I'll tell you something. If you have a 2-acre lot and a tree situated in the middle of it, you just may be able to pull this off. When you're laying these out, you just lay them to the maximum length you can in whatever direction you're pointing at, because if there's a rock that intervenes and you want to stick the wire, you're free to go ahead. There's really no such thing as resonance with the radials once they're on the ground. So, that being the case, they don't have to be of equal length. One configuration that I work with just had a borderline to one property that would barely accommodate 105 feet, and that's what I used for a third of the stretches, and then used 125 for the rest. The more the merrier, put them up. I did a presentation on inverted Ls, and Professor Paul from the Norwalk Club was here. He's done a lot of research on radials. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of debate on the subject of radials and how many you have to put down. Paul was saying that he's done all his research, and he's come to the conclusion that if you can just get 15 or 20 up, it's good enough. See if you can shoot for that as long as you're going to go through the process. But God bless you, if you can get 60, that's great. If you can get 120, that's an engineering book dream. Here's one of the cutest things devised for ham radio. The solution for radials. I think you've seen one of these before. Take it and just pass it around. You are looking at the modern, biodegradable radial staple. So no kidding, when you're laying down the radials on the lawn, right? Your partner just holds the wire taut, you place it down, and you stomp about every 10 feet. And if you do this at the beginning of a spring lawn season, by the time you hit 3 months growth, nobody will ever see the radial again.
But
So they're
it's
very
there.
effective. It's there.
Doesn't dissolve.
Yep.
Just
The wire,
rolls over.
You know, that dissolves, but
Not-
certainly the
you're not-
wire doesn't. That's
you're
not
not
the
cutting
intent.
slots for the wires?
You can too. That's your other option.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, the gardener or the lawnmower will rip up.
these guys right here, the glorified pizza cutter edger. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? But the big thing, so you know, that the pros would use to roll back and forth. That'll do just fine. My wife got me a heavy duty version at a tag sale for $8. How can you do better than that?
Yeah, but my guy comes and dethatches the lawn or something.
Right.
That would just,
That would be tough. That would be tough. You'd want to bury them then.
yeah.
All right? But you know, you don't have to bury much. Give them a 1/4 inch.
Yeah, I use, I've done it, I've put some kind of nasty drill bit on it, could use an electric drill and just gouge the soil.
They don't have to be straight.
Yeah, just stomp on it and,
To me, some of the best antenna folk in the United States are the Midwestern farm boys who went off to engineering school and then came home to run the family farm. And if you want to see some of the burial configurations that they put together and how they've adapted like commercial conduit laying equipment to put down radials. You know, when it's like a Amish barn raising, they'll go back and forth to each other's farms. Have the helicopter fly in the commercial FM tower they just bought from the local defunct radio station that went out of business. Ground the thing and then get it on the air for 160 meters. You think this is crazy, but that's what those guys do for fun. If I lived out in Kansas, I'd be doing the same thing. Unfortunately, none of us do.
well, every once in a while you see an ad in the back of QST.
I'm moving to Florida.
Right.
Am paradise. I look at those ads all the time.
Yeah,
And there's
Yep.
one right now in Florida.
Right?
yeah, 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 looks nice.
Sounds like another elderly person
Really.
met his maker in
Yeah.
God's waiting
Yes,
room.
well, that's where you go to die,
Next one.
unfortunately.
I have had an inverted L configuration where I put 20 radials down. It really killed me.
Yeah.
It was the onset of my cardiac issues.
So,
It didn't cause them, by the way. It's just a coincidence that happened at the same time. That's what I'll always remember. Just as I got up to radials 19 and 20, I'm like, oh my God, I've lived through this experience. 2 days
hot
later,
day also.
I'm in my cardiologist's office, who's just been appointed by cardiologist, saying something doesn't feel right, doctor.
No.
These are the answer if you can pull them off. It sounds a little discouraging, but it's a lot more practical than you think. Elevated radials.
Oh,
You
it's
need
not ugly.
4. You'd be surprised. The more the merrier. So no kidding, there's a contest operator who's saying, I've got my spoke version inverted L and it's fed by 25 elevated radials. And that's what I'm thinking, oh man, this guy owns a big farm spread and no one walks around on that farm.
Yeah.
130 foot length, that's what you're looking for. Because now remember, these are resonant radials.
Yeah.
These are not on the ground. So this is part of an antenna. This is like an old-fashioned VHF antenna you might have seen the tow truck operator working with out of the gas station, on a vertical antenna. That kind of a configuration. Minimum height, 16 feet. So, like I say, think of the old gas station, mechanics antenna. The radials are 15 to 20 feet off the ground, connected to a central hub, and up goes the vertical element. It's the classic configuration. The cheap way to do it is with regular wire hung from an oak tree or a hemlock tree or a tulip tree if you're lucky to have one that's over 100 feet tall. If you are, whatever you do not buy a commercial antenna. I don't care if it's the $899 one from DX Engineering, though I love those folks. It's not going to do you any better than the vertical hung from that tree. Next one, 16 feet. That can go to your advantage though. I'm going to present kind of a design in a minute I just want to get through this part of the beverages. If you're a serious DX operator, your real secret is that you're using a vertical on transmit and you're using a beverage on receive. A vertical gets you a nice low angle radiation, or low angle radiation, which is what you're looking for DX. The other aspect of it, though, is they're very noisy. So for receiving, they can drive you crazy. I mean, you can hear a signal, but the noise will drive you crazy over the course of, an elongated listening session. So the whole thing is you put together a configuration where you're transmitting on the vertical, and what you've got is a beverage for your receive antenna. This is the Shangri-La of a 160-meter operation, and if you're out in Nebraska, this is easy, and you can do the whole thing for $500 and get one of the world's most efficient ham radio stations on 160. If you're lucky enough to have a lot this size here on the East Coast, hell, with the tax bill that you're paying, that's probably 5 times my annual salary, right? So, you need room, but there's good news. Technology has intervened recently. So, the key with the beverage is you use them. They're an inherently low noise antenna. You use them with a low noise preamp, for which you will spend a fair amount of cash. So there's a couple in competing catalogs. You got to figure that you're going to spend about $140, $150 for the preamps. The whole concept of the beverage is they're not susceptible to any natural interference. They're dead quiet, but they're not gain antennas. In fact, they're negative gain antennas. But you're taking a signal with no noise, and if you run it through a low noise preamplifier, you can amplify it an incredible amount and get a perfectly clean signal. And it's like night and day. On a vertical, you won't even know they're there. On the beverage, you'll hear them as clear as day. But you're going through an antenna that's several hundred feet long and a preamp to get to that situation. Okay, next one. A conventional beverage. Don't be discouraged. You might be able to pull this on better than you can. I may yet do this surreptitiously on a piece of property somewhere someday. But you can get a conventional beverage, and for 160, minimum 290-foot run, really 585-foot run to take yourself seriously, to get yourself even more serious, 880 feet. But if you could just pull off 585 feet, be a nice configuration. It doesn't have to be up much, 9 or 10 feet. It's kind of a blessing and a curse. You don't want to get it much higher because this is not a high efficiency antenna and you don't want it to be. It's designed to hug the surface. So if you raise it another foot or two to make it less inconspicuous, you're actually losing out as a result. But boy, if you had some dense jungle on a protected property next door to you, this would be a nice configuration to run. Again, you really need a low noise preamp. You'll see these things advertised, on eBay or what have you. And they'll say beverage kit, $95. It's got a, connector, it's got an adapter, a single feed balun, one or two other things. But unless you get a preamp, you're not going to be happy with the results. Here's the new innovation. I've got one of these. I've yet to use it though. So Andy, you have to help me tweak this thing finally. We laid it out last year, but I've yet to actually operate it. It's up in the pit area. So, here's the deal. Beverage on a ground, a bog. It's a design that's actually been out there for a while. And there's a guy that's very well respected in the ham community that did some research, came up with a design, and it's really supposed to work well. People are very high on this product. Here's the thing. You only need 200 feet. This is not impossible for some, all right? Literally, the wire's on the ground. So you get a bunch of those plastic staples, right? You run the wire, you stomp one of those staples every 10 feet, you're good to go. Hey, if at the end of the day you don't want to leave it, you can just yank the wire right through the staples and take it home with you. It's got an amplifier, and it's got an insulator on one side where you feed it, and it's got a reflector circuit on the other side. So what this actually is a bi-directional reversible beverage. And you're finally done with the configuration, meaning you can shoot it forward or you can shoot it in reverse. Equally effective in either direction. The ultimate scenario, you could do this for about maybe $800 in terms of equipment. 2 reversible beverages at right angles. Full coverage, because these things have about a 90-degree beamwidth. And it's a dream configuration, but you'd be surprised how doable this is. If you just have one cooperative neighbor and you have an elongated lot, all you tell the neighbor, which is true, is this is a receive-only antenna. It's just an extension of it. No RF's going to be radiated into your yard. This is like a grounding mechanism, which is really what it is in the end. Really works out nice. Go to the next one for me. Summary, but then we're going to go into some individual situational design with you guys. Look, we all live in New England. You want to know the reality of it? The land is expensive, the terrain's grounding is poor, about as bad as any part of the United States. So you got everything working against you. Despite everything you've heard me say about minimum and won't work, if you have no other alternatives, just get on the air anyway and see what you work out with. All right? Fred, we've taken a vote. We've decided unanimously that you are now old enough to operate on 160 meters. Only Fred understands the significance of this remark.
Yeah. What are you talking to N1ZZ?
Yes. Let's talk about Dan the Man's configuration. If you ask Dan, what did you use? Now, the last time I spoke to Dan, I don't know whether he adjusted the number. Are you ready for this? 297 countries on 160 meters. 297 countries. What's he operate with? He would call it a vertical. It's an inverted L. So I think he had like 100-foot vertical run, but then the top was bent, because he run out of elevation. And that's what he used. Now, I think he also used beverages on receive, or he might have had a specialty like K9, AY type array, but he did have a specialty listening antenna. So you just give it a shot with what you've got. I've been on the air for 2 160-meter competitions.